The scariest men I've ever met didn't threaten me. They thanked me politely first. Rain turned the Manhattan sidewalks into mirrors that night, reflecting yellow taxi lights and blurred neon signs across puddles deep enough to soak through my sneakers in seconds. Most people kept their heads down and walked faster whenever the weather got ugly, but I'd always liked the rain. It made the city quieter somehow, softer, like even New York needed a moment to breathe. I had just finished my late shift at Bellamy Books on Lexington Avenue, and my canvas tote bag felt heavier than usual against my shoulder, stuffed with used textbooks and a turkey sandwich I'd been too busy to eat during break. My phone said 10:42 p.m. Too late for normal people. Perfect timing for Manhattan's strange ones. Wind whipped through the intersection ahead of me as I waited for the crosswalk signal to change. Cars splashed through the avenue, headlights cutting silver lines through the storm. That was when I noticed him standing alone near the curb. An older man, maybe late 70s, tall, dressed far too elegantly for the weather in a charcoal overcoat that probably cost more than my monthly rent. His silver hair was soaked from the rain, and one hand gripped a black cane while the other searched carefully through empty air like he was trying to feel where the street began. Nobody stopped. A woman in heels brushed past him without looking up from her phone. Two businessmen crossed before the light even changed. A cab nearly clipped the edge of the curb beside him, spraying dirty water across his polished shoes. Still, he stayed there quietly, waiting, something twisted in my chest. Maybe because he reminded me of my grandfather before the stroke. Maybe because the city had a way of swallowing gentle people whole if nobody slowed down long enough to notice them. The signal flashed walk. I stepped toward him before I could overthink it. "Sir? Would you like some help crossing?" He turned toward my voice immediately, not startled, calm. His pale grey eyes didn't quite focus correctly, and that was when I realized he was blind, completely blind. "That obvious?" he asked with the faintest smile. His voice carried a smooth old-world accent I couldn't place exactly. Italian, maybe. "Only to someone actually paying attention," I replied. A quiet laugh escaped him then, warm, genuine. Not what I expected from a stranger standing alone in the rain at almost 11 o'clock at night. "People don't usually stop anymore," he said. "Everyone's in a hurry." I hesitated before gently touching his arm. "Well, tonight I'm not." His sleeve felt expensive beneath my fingers. Not just rich people expensive, untouchable expensive. The kind of fabric that belonged inside black luxury SUVs with tinted windows and men who never heard the word no. We stepped into the crosswalk together as traffic rolled impatiently around us. His hand rested lightly against mine. Despite the cold rain, his grip felt steady, stronger than I expected. Halfway across the street, a black Escalade suddenly slowed near the intersection, then another behind it. Both identical, my stomach tightened instinctively. The windows were dark enough that I couldn't see inside, but somehow I felt watched anyway. The older man noticed my silence. "You're nervous now," he said gently. "Should I be?" I asked before I could stop myself. Another small smile touched his mouth. "That depends who noticed your kindness tonight." The answer should unsettled me more than it did. Instead, I found myself helping him onto the opposite sidewalk, while rainwater dripped from my hair onto my jacket collar. Claire Dawson," he said suddenly. I froze. "How do you know my name?" His expression softened slightly. "Your bookstore name tag is reflective." Heat crept into my cheeks. "Right, of course." I let out a nervous breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. "You really shouldn't be out alone in weather like this," I said. "My son tells me the same thing." Something about the way he said "son" made the air feel heavier between us. Before I could ask anything else, one of the SUV doors opened across the street. A tall man stepped out holding a black umbrella. Even from half a block away, he looked intimidating. Broad shoulders, dark coat, still as stone. Waiting, the older man tilted his head slightly toward the sound of the door closing. "Ah," he murmured, "looks like I've been found." Then he reached into his coat pocket and pressed something into my hand. A silver St. Christopher medallion, warm from his skin. "For your kindness," he said quietly. "Keep it with you tonight." I stared down at it, confused. "Sir, I can't take this." But when I looked up again, the tall man had already crossed the street toward us. And for the very first time that night, I understood why nobody else had stopped for the blind old man in the rain. There is a very specific kind of fear that settles into your stomach when powerful people suddenly know your address. I realized that at 12:14 in the morning, while staring through the peephole of my apartment door at three men wearing black coats that probably cost more than everything inside my studio combined. Rainwater still clung to their shoulders from the storm outside, but somehow they looked untouched by the weather. Controlled, precise, dangerous in the quietest possible way, and standing in the center of them was him. The tall man from the crosswalk. Up close, he looked even more intimidating than before. Around 6'3", dark hair brushed neatly away from a face too sharp to belong to someone gentle. His jaw carried the faint shadow of exhaustion, but his posture remained perfectly straight, like he had spent his entire life refusing to bend for anyone. The hallway light caught silver rain droplets along the collar of his black wool coat. His eyes lifted toward the peephole suddenly, directly toward me, as if he already knew I was there. My pulse stumbled. Then he spoke through the door in a calm, low voice that somehow made the tiny apartment feel smaller. "Miss Dawson, my father asked to see you again. I should not have opened the door. Every survival instinct I possessed screamed that at me immediately, but curiosity has always been my worst quality." I unlocked the deadbolt carefully and opened the door only halfway. "Chain is after midnight," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. "Most normal people send flowers when they want to thank someone." One corner of his mouth moved slightly, not quite a smile, more like he was unfamiliar with the concept. "I do not think anyone has ever called me normal before." His voice carried the same faint Italian edge as the older man's, smooth, controlled, expensive sounding somehow. I tightened my grip on the door. "Who are you?" Silence lingered for half a second too long. Then one of the men behind him shifted slightly, and suddenly I understood something important. The other two watched him constantly, not casually, carefully, like men waiting for orders. The tall stranger finally answered. "Sebastian Romano." The name meant nothing to me at first. Then everything changed. My stomach dropped so fast it almost hurt, because 3 nights ago, while shelving mystery novels at Bellamy Books, I had overheard 2 NYU girls whispering about that exact name over iced coffee and true crime podcasts. Romano, the man newspapers never photographed directly, the businessman nobody questioned publicly, the ghost attached to half the luxury construction projects in Manhattan. Some people called him a billionaire, others called him something far worse. I stared at him differently after that. He noticed immediately. Of course he did. Men like him probably survived by noticing everything. "Ah," he said quietly, "there it is. There is what?" The moment fear arrives. Heat rushed into my face, partly embarrassment, partly anger. "You show up outside my apartment after midnight with bodyguards and expect me not to be nervous?" His gaze drifted briefly down the hallway behind me, scanning the apartment in one smooth glance. Books stacked near the couch, cheap kitchen table. Laundry basket I forgot to move earlier. I suddenly hated how small my life looked under his attention. "I did not come here to frighten you," he said. "Then why are you here?" Rain tapped softly against the apartment window beside us. Somewhere downstairs, a siren echoed through the wet Manhattan streets. Sebastian reached slowly into his coat pocket, and every muscle in my body tightened before he withdrew a small silver object, my St. Christopher medallion. I had forgotten it completely in the panic of getting home. "My father noticed you left this behind," he said. "He insisted I return it personally." I stared at the necklace resting in his palm. "You came all the way here for that?" Something unreadable crossed his expression then. Tiredness maybe, or amusement. "No." His answer came softer this time. Honest, dangerous because of how honest it sounded. "I came because someone took photographs of you tonight." The air disappeared from my lungs. "What?" One of the bodyguards shifted again behind him while Sebastian held my gaze steadily. "When you helped my father cross the street, several people noticed." His eyes darkened slightly, and in my world, attention can become a problem very quickly. I opened the door another inch without realizing it. "I do not understand what that means. That makes 2 of us." He looked briefly down the hallway behind me again, focused, thinking, then his voice lowered. "Tell me honestly, Claire, did anyone follow you home tonight?" A chill moved slowly down my spine, because for the first time since leaving work earlier, I remembered the black sedan parked across the street outside my building with its headlights off. My grandmother used to say that rich people carried silence differently than the rest of us. Standing there in my apartment doorway at nearly 1 in the morning, staring at Sebastian Romano while rainwater slid down the edges of his black coat, I finally understood what she meant. He was not loud, he was not threatening, but the hallway itself felt quieter around him somehow, like the building had learned not to interrupt. I folded my arms tightly across my chest, suddenly aware that I was standing barefoot in an oversized bookstore sweatshirt while one of the most dangerous men in Manhattan calmly discussed surveillance outside my apartment. "You think someone followed me?" I asked carefully. Sebastian did not answer immediately. Instead, he glanced toward the rain-streaked window near my couch, watching, calculating. His bodyguards remained completely still behind him, almost blending into the dim hallway light. "I think," he said finally, "that too many people noticed you tonight." His eyes returned to mine then, dark and unreadable. "And my father is not an ordinary man to be seen with." I almost laughed at the understatement. "Neither are you." A flicker of something crossed his face, not pride. If anything, it looked closer to regret. "No," he admitted quietly. Thunder rolled somewhere beyond the city skyline. The black sedan across the street still sat parked beneath a flickering street lamp, engine off. Waiting, my stomach tightened harder the longer I stared at it through the glass. "Maybe it is just someone who lives nearby," I said, though even I did not sound convinced. Sebastian stepped slightly closer to the doorway beside me. Not enough to invade my space completely, just enough that I caught the faint scent of cedarwood and rain lingering against his coat collar. Expensive, clean, dangerous in a way that made my pulse behave strangely. "Do you believe that?" he asked softly. I swallowed. "No." Silence settled between us for a moment. Then Sebastian looked past me into the apartment again. "You live alone? That is usually how studio apartments work." One of his bodyguards almost smiled at that before quickly hiding it again. Sebastian, however, remained completely serious. "You joke when you are nervous and you stare too much when you are hiding things." That finally earned the faintest reaction from him. A small exhale through his nose that almost resembled amusement. Almost. "You should not open the door so easily, Claire. You literally came with security guards." Exactly. The way he said it sent another chill through me, not because of what he meant, because of how calm he remained while saying it. Like danger was so normal in his world that he no longer noticed its weight. I glanced again toward the sedan outside. "So what happens now?" Sebastian reached into his coat pocket slowly and removed a pair of black leather gloves. He rolled them carefully between his fingers while thinking. "Now," he said, "I ask you to trust me for the next 10 minutes. Every smart decision I had ever made in my life should have ended the conversation right there. Instead, I heard myself ask, why?" His gaze locked onto mine with unnerving intensity. "Because if someone is watching this building," he said quietly, "I would rather they see you leave with me than alone tomorrow morning." My heartbeat stumbled hard against my ribs. "Leave with you? Temporarily?" That sounds exactly like something a kidnapper would say. One of the bodyguards looked toward the ceiling like he was trying not to laugh. Sebastian remained perfectly composed. "If I intended to kidnap you, Claire," he said calmly, "I would not stand outside your apartment discussing it politely." I hated that the logic almost made sense. Rain continued, tapping softly against the window while Manhattan glowed gold and silver beyond the glass. The apartment suddenly felt impossibly small compared to the storm gathering outside it. Sebastian looked toward the sedan one final time before speaking again. "You asked me earlier why I came personally tonight." His voice lowered slightly. "The truth is, my father has not spoken warmly about anyone in years." Something shifted in his expression then briefly, so fast I almost missed it. Not weakness, not softness exactly, but something human beneath all the control. "He remembered your voice after only 5 minutes. Sebastian continued quietly. I did not know what to say to that, because somewhere beneath the fear and confusion and exhaustion, I remembered the blind old man smiling in the rain like kindness still surprised him. Sebastian reached toward me slowly then, and every nerve in my body tightened before he carefully placed the silver medallion back into my hand. His fingers brushed mine for less than a second. Warm, steady. "Please pack a small bag," he said softly. "I have a feeling tonight is about to become very complicated." And almost on cue, headlights from the black sedan suddenly switched on across the street. The strange thing about fear is that it sharpens some details while erasing others completely. Later, I could remember the exact sound rain made against Sebastian Romano's coat buttons while he stood inside my apartment doorway. I could remember the gold reflection of headlights moving across his jawline when the black sedan outside turned its engine on. But I could not remember deciding to trust him. Somehow it simply happened. 10 minutes, he said again quietly. That is all I am asking for. I looked toward the sedan parked across the street. The headlights remained pointed directly at my building now, glowing through the rain like watchful eyes. Every instinct told me none of this was normal anymore. Not the old man, not Sebastian, not the feeling that my tiny bookstore life had somehow wandered into the middle of something far larger than me. Fine, I said finally. 10 minutes. One of the bodyguards immediately stepped away down the hallway, speaking softly into an earpiece. Sebastian stayed where he was, watching me carefully while I moved around my apartment grabbing essentials with shaking hands. Phone charger, jeans, toothbrush, my grandmother's silver ring from the bathroom counter. The entire time, I could feel his attention following me without him ever appearing intrusive about it. Controlled, respectful, which somehow made it worse. You always pack this lightly. I zipped my small overnight bag closed. Some of us do not own private jets. Another almost smile touched his face briefly. Fair enough. The bodyguard returned then, speaking quietly in Italian. Sebastian listened without interrupting, his expression changing only slightly at whatever was said. Colder somehow, more focused. When the man finished, Sebastian nodded once before turning back toward me. We need to leave now. Something in his tone erased all argument from my mind instantly. Outside, the storm had grown heavier. Rain hammered against the sidewalk hard enough to bounce back upward in silver mist beneath the streetlights. The moment we stepped outside my building, I felt exposed. Watched. Sebastian moved closer automatically, positioning himself between me and the street without making it obvious. His hand rested lightly against the center of my back as we crossed toward the waiting SUV. Warm, steady, entirely too familiar for a man I had met less than 2 hours ago. The black Escalade idled silently near the curb while another SUV waited behind it. Dark windows, black rims, the kind of vehicles politicians pretended not to own publicly. Sebastian opened the rear passenger door himself before looking down at me. That is comforting, I muttered. Claire. His voice lowered slightly. Serious as now, please. I obeyed without another joke. The leather seats smelled faintly like cedar and expensive cologne as I slid inside. Warm lighting glowed softly overhead while rain streaked the tinted windows beside me. Sebastian entered beside me seconds later, and the door shut with a heavy sound that instantly separated us from the city outside. One of the bodyguards climbed into the front passenger seat while the second vehicle behind us slowly pulled away from the curb first. Why does this feel like a presidential evacuation? I asked quietly. Sebastian glanced toward the side mirror. Because someone followed you home. My chest tightened hard. How can you tell? The sedan moved the moment we exited your building. He spoke with terrifying calm, like this kind of thing happened before breakfast in his world. I looked back through the rear window carefully. The black sedan remained 3 car lengths behind the second SUV now, consistent, deliberate. Maybe they are just driving the same direction, I whispered weakly. Sebastian turned his head slightly toward me then. Claire. Silence filled the vehicle for a few seconds while Manhattan slid past outside in blurred streaks of neon and rainwater. Finally, I looked at him directly. What exactly does your father do? The question hung between us heavily. Sebastian leaned back slightly against the leather seat, one hand resting loosely near his watch. Elegant watch, old money watch. The kind passed down through generations instead of purchased impulsively. My father built shipping companies, he said carefully. Real estate, and his eyes met mine again. Dark, patient, and men with power create enemies naturally. I almost laughed at how polished the answer sounded. That is the cleanest non-answer I have ever heard. To my surprise, that actually earned a real reaction from him this time. Brief, quiet, a low breath that sounded dangerously close to amusement. You are handling this unusually well. No, I admitted honestly while tightening my grip on my bag. I am handling this terribly. I just have not processed it yet. Something softened in his expression for half a second. Then the driver suddenly spoke from the front seat in a tense voice. Sir. Sebastian's attention snapped forward instantly. The bodyguard in front pointed toward the mirror. The black sedan behind us had accelerated. The first thing I learned about men like Sebastian Romano was that panic never reached their faces first. It reached everyone else around them. The driver's shoulders tightened almost instantly. The bodyguard in the passenger seat touched his earpiece and spoke rapid Italian under his breath. Even the atmosphere inside the SUV changed, becoming sharper somehow, more alert. Sebastian, however, stayed perfectly still beside me, calm enough to make my own heartbeat sound embarrassingly loud by comparison. Rain streaked across the windows while Manhattan blurred around us in gold and white reflections. I twisted carefully in my seat to glance behind us again. The black sedan had closed the distance by at least 2 car lengths. Maybe they just hate safe driving, I whispered weakly. Sebastian did not look away from the side mirror. Claire right, still not funny. One of the bodyguards in front murmured something tense in Italian. Sebastian answered immediately, his tone low and controlled. I could not understand the words, but I understood the authority inside them. The kind that did not need volume to command obedience. The SUV accelerated smoothly through the wet avenue, weaving past late-night traffic with careful precision. Outside, rain hammered against the glass hard enough to blur entire buildings into watercolor shadows. "You should not be involved in this," Sebastian said quietly after a moment. I let out a short, nervous laugh. That feels like information I could have used about 3 hours ago. Finally, he looked at me directly, really looked at me, not scanning, not assessing, just watching my face with an intensity that made it difficult to breathe normally. "Helping my father was kind," he said softly, "but kindness has consequences around people like me." I stared at him for a second before answering. "That might be the saddest thing anyone has ever said to me." Something flickered in his eyes, then briefly human. Then the bodyguard in front suddenly turned halfway in his seat. "They are still behind us," Sebastian nodded once, calm, thoughtful. "Take the tunnel route." The driver immediately changed lanes without question. Tires hissed across rain-soaked pavement as we descended toward the tunnel entrance beneath the city. My hands tightened around the strap of my overnight bag. "Okay," I said slowly. "I need someone to explain what exactly is happening before I completely lose my mind." Sebastian leaned back slightly beside me, one arm resting along the seat behind us, not touching me, never pushing into my space. Somehow that restraint made him feel more dangerous instead of less. "There are organizations in this city," he said carefully, "that monitor my family very closely. Organizations sounds cleaner than gangs." A faint breath escaped him again, almost amusement. "You are very honest when frightened. I work retail in Manhattan. Fear is basically part of the healthcare plan." One of the guards actually laughed quietly at that before immediately pretending he had not. Sebastian ignored him. "When someone unexpected interacts with my father publicly," he continued, "certain people become curious because they think I matter to you." His gaze held mine steadily now. Yes, the honesty of the answer landed harder than I expected, because it had only been one night, one rainy crosswalk, one small act of kindness, yet somehow this man was already moving me through Manhattan in armored SUVs, while strangers followed us through the rain. "That is insane," I whispered. "It is my life." The simplicity of the answer silenced me for a moment. Outside, the tunnel swallowed us in artificial light and wet concrete echoes. The sedan behind us remained visible 2 lanes over now, headlights glowing pale through the spray. "Do they know who I am?" I asked quietly. Sebastian's expression darkened slightly. "I would prefer to keep it that way, and if you cannot," for the first time since I met him, real emotion slipped through his composure. Small, dangerous, protective in a way that made my chest tighten unexpectedly. "Then I will make certain nobody gets close enough to matter." My pulse stumbled hard at the way he said it. Not dramatic, not threatening, absolute, like gravity, like winter, like something that simply existed whether the world approved of it or not. The SUV suddenly turned sharply onto a private underground ramp guarded by black gates and security cameras mounted every 20 feet. The sedan behind us tried to follow for half a second before steel barriers dropped automatically between the lanes. I looked back just in time to see the other car disappear behind concrete walls and flashing red lights. Silence filled the SUV afterward, heavy, controlled. Then Sebastian finally exhaled slowly beside me. "Good," he murmured. "Now we can talk safely." I frowned slightly. "About what?" The underground garage lights reflected gold against his dark eyes as he turned toward me fully. "About why my father recognized your voice immediately. Rich people build upward." That was the first thought that entered my mind as the private elevator carried us silently toward whatever world existed above the underground garage. The walls were black marble veined with gold, polished so perfectly they reflected soft amber light across Sebastian Romano's face while he stood beside me with one hand in the pocket of his dark coat. Even the elevator felt expensive. Quiet in a way ordinary places never are. No rattling cables, no flickering fluorescent lights, just silence and the faint scent of cedarwood lingering in the air around him. I tightened my grip on my overnight bag while trying not to look intimidated, failing completely. "You still have not answered my question," I said finally. Sebastian glanced toward me. "Which one?" "The part where your father somehow recognized my voice after meeting me for 5 minutes in the rain." Something unreadable crossed his expression again. "Careful. My father lost his eyesight 11 years ago," he said quietly. "After that, he learned to recognize people differently." The elevator doors opened before I could respond, and suddenly the rest of Manhattan disappeared behind me. The penthouse looked less like an apartment and more like a private museum designed by someone who had never once checked a bank account before making decisions. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the entire living space, revealing rain-soaked city lights stretching endlessly beneath the storm outside. Black marble floors reflected warm golden lamps positioned beside cream-colored furniture that looked too expensive to touch. A grand piano rested near the windows. Fresh white orchids lined a dining table large enough to seat 20 people comfortably. Everything felt elegant, untouchable, just like Sebastian himself. But what caught my attention most was the silence. No televisions, no music, no loud conversations echoing through giant rooms. Only soft rainfall against glass and the distant hum of Manhattan far below us. "This is where you live?" I asked quietly. Sebastian removed his coat slowly, draping it over the back of a chair with practiced precision. "Sometimes that sounds suspiciously mysterious." "You will find I am consistently mysterious." Despite myself, I almost smiled. One of the bodyguards disappeared down a hallway while another moved toward the windows, scanning the streets below with quiet focus. Sebastian noticed me watching them. "You are safe here," he said. "Nobody enters this floor without my permission." That is somehow comforting and terrifying at the same time. A soft voice interrupted us from across the room. "Claire." I turned immediately. The blind old man stood near the piano now, one hand resting lightly against the polished wood. He had changed into a charcoal sweater and dark slacks, but somehow he still looked elegant enough to belong in old black and white movies. "You made it," he said warmly. "Barely," I admitted. "Your son has a very dramatic definition of transportation." To my surprise, the older man laughed softly, genuine laughter. Sebastian looked mildly offended. "The situation required caution. You brought 2 SUVs and 3 bodyguards to pick up a bookstore employee." "4 bodyguards," he corrected calmly. "One remained downstairs." I stared at him. "That is worse." His father smiled faintly while moving carefully toward the sound of my voice. "Forgive Sebastian," he said gently. "He was raised to expect danger before kindness." Something about the sentence changed the atmosphere instantly, because Sebastian did not argue with it, did not deny it. He simply stood there beside the city lights, looking tired in a way powerful men were probably never supposed to look. The older man reached for my hand carefully, and I let him take it. His grip felt warm despite the storm outside. "Thank you for helping me tonight," he said quietly. "Most people only see inconvenience when they look at old men." My chest tightened unexpectedly. "My grandfather was blind too," I admitted softly, "after his stroke." The older man stilled slightly at that. "Ah," he murmured. "That explains your voice." I frowned. My voice. Sebastian moved closer then, his expression thoughtful. "You spoke to my father the same way people speak to someone they love," he said quietly, "not someone they pity." The words landed somewhere deep inside me before I could stop them, because suddenly the fear inside this penthouse felt smaller than it had downstairs in the rain. The older man squeezed my hand gently. "I am Lorenzo Romano," he said, "and I believe fate has a very strange sense of humor." Before I could answer, one of the bodyguards reappeared from the hallway carrying a thin black folder. He handed it silently to Sebastian, whose expression darkened the moment he opened it. The warmth vanished from the room almost instantly. "What is it?" Lorenzo asked quietly. Sebastian's eyes lifted toward me slowly, controlled again, cold again. "Someone already knows Claire Dawson is here. People think fear arrives all at once. It does not. Real fear arrives quietly, one sentence at a time. Someone already knows Claire Dawson is here." The words settled into the penthouse like smoke, changing the temperature of the room without anyone raising their voice. Lorenzo Romano slowly released my hand, while Sebastian closed the black folder with controlled precision. No panic, no visible anger. Somehow that made it worse. Powerful men who stayed calm usually had reasons to. Rain continued sliding down the massive windows overlooking Manhattan while soft piano music drifted faintly from hidden speakers somewhere above us. The contrast felt unreal. A beautiful room, a beautiful city, terrifying conversation. "What exactly does that mean?" I asked carefully. Sebastian looked toward one of his guards instead of answering me immediately. "Who received the message?" "An encrypted contact tied to Moretti's shipping accounts." The guard replied quietly. "No direct threat, only her name, and this address." My stomach tightened. Lorenzo sighed softly from near the piano. That was fast. Sebastian's jaw hardened slightly. Too fast. I crossed my arms instinctively. I officially need more information than mysterious rich people giving each other dramatic looks. To my surprise, Lorenzo smiled faintly at that. "You remind me of my wife," he said quietly. She also became irritated when men tried to sound important instead of honest. Something softened briefly in Sebastian's expression at the mention of her. It vanished almost immediately. "Claire deserves clarity," Lorenzo continued calmly. "Especially now." Sebastian remained silent for a second before finally looking directly at me. "There are families in this city that compete for influence," he said carefully. "Some legal, some not. Mafia," I translated flatly. He did not confirm it, which honestly confirmed it enough. "People watch my father because he still matters," Sebastian continued. "And tonight, for reasons we do not yet understand, they noticed you. Because I helped him cross the street. Because you touched him." The room went quiet after that. I frowned slightly. Lorenzo answered this time. "Nobody touches me outside this family." I looked toward him confused. Why? A sad smile crossed his face. "Because fear teaches distance." The sentence lingered heavily between us. Suddenly I remembered the way pedestrians avoided him in the rain, the way nobody slowed down, nobody looked directly at him, not because he was blind, because they recognized him. "People knew who you were tonight," I whispered. Lorenzo nodded gently. "Most likely." I stared at Sebastian afterward. "And you still let me walk straight into all of this?" Something dangerous flickered behind his eyes then. Not anger at me, anger at himself maybe. "No," he said quietly. "I tried to remove you from it the moment I realized what happened." His honesty unsettled me more than excuses would have. One of the guards approached quietly then, offering me a small glass of water. I accepted it mostly because my hands needed something to do besides shake. Sebastian watched the movement carefully, always watching, always assessing. "You should rest tonight," he said after a moment. "Tomorrow we will figure out next steps." I almost laughed from exhaustion. "Tomorrow I am supposed to open the bookstore at 8:30. You are not returning there tomorrow." The immediate firmness in his voice caught me off guard. "You do not get to decide that." "Actually," he said calmly, "right now I do." Heat rushed into my face instantly. "Excuse me." Lorenzo sighed softly under his breath, like this conversation had happened before. "Sebastian." But Sebastian's attention never left mine. "Until we understand who is watching you," he said quietly. "You cannot just lock me inside a penthouse because rich criminals are feeling paranoid." "Claire," his voice lowered slightly, "controlled, dangerous. This is not paranoia." Silence stretched between us. I hated how steady he looked while saying it. Hated how part of me already believed him completely. Somewhere outside, thunder rolled across the city again. Lorenzo carefully found his chair beside the piano and sat down slowly. Tiredness suddenly showed in his face for the first time all night. "Enough for tonight," he murmured gently. "The girl is frightened." Sebastian's expression shifted immediately at the words. Softer, regretful almost. He looked toward me again. And for the first time since entering the penthouse, his voice lost some of its cold precision. "I know this is overwhelming," he said quietly, "but I need you to trust me a little longer." My fingers tightened around the silver medallion still resting in my palm. "That is becoming a very expensive request." One corner of his mouth moved slightly again, barely there. "Unfortunately," he said softly, "you met me on a very expensive night." Then his phone vibrated suddenly in the silence. Sebastian glanced down at the screen once. Whatever he saw made all warmth disappear from his face immediately. There is something deeply unsettling about watching a man lose warmth in real time. 1 second, Sebastian Romano stood beside me, looking almost human beneath the soft gold lights of his penthouse. The next, whatever appeared on his phone turned him into something colder, sharper, dangerous in that quiet way powerful men become when emotion gets replaced by calculation. He stared at the screen for exactly 3 seconds before slipping the phone back into his pocket. No reaction beyond that. No curse words, no panic. Somehow the restraint frightened me more than anger would have. "Sebastian," Lorenzo said calmly from beside the piano. "What happened?" His son hesitated for half a heartbeat. Then he answered in a voice so controlled it barely sounded human anymore. "Someone accessed security footage from the intersection tonight." My stomach dropped instantly. "The crosswalk?" Sebastian nodded once. The footage should have been erased already. One of the guards stepped closer immediately. Internal breach? Possibly. Sebastian's gaze shifted toward the rain-soaked skyline outside the windows, thinking, measuring consequences I could not even see yet. Or someone anticipated our cleanup protocols. I stared at him in disbelief. "Did you just say cleanup protocols?" His eyes returned to mine slowly. "Claire, no, seriously, what kind of life is this?" For the first time all evening, frustration cracked through his calm exterior slightly. The kind where mistakes become expensive very quickly. Silence settled over the room afterward, heavy, exhausting. I suddenly realized how tired I was, not physically, emotionally. 3 hours ago, my biggest concern had been overdue student loan emails and whether the bookstore espresso machine was finally broken for good. Now I stood inside a billionaire Mafia penthouse listening to men discuss erased surveillance footage like it was normal office conversation. Lorenzo broke the silence gently. "You should eat something, Claire," I blinked. "I am sorry." Fear feels worse on an empty stomach, despite everything. A weak laugh escaped me. The old man smiled faintly. "Ah, there it is again." Sebastian glanced toward him. "What the sound?" Lorenzo said softly. The apartment finally sounds less frightened when she laughs. Something shifted across Sebastian's expression too quickly for me to fully read it. Then he looked away first. That tiny detail unsettled me more than it should have. One of the staff members appeared silently from another hallway, carrying tea and small plates of food I had not even noticed being prepared. The service inside this place moved like invisible machinery, efficient, silent, almost military. I sat carefully at the edge of the long dining table while Sebastian remained standing near the windows, phone in hand again, watching the city, watching everything. "Does he ever relax?" I asked quietly toward Lorenzo. The older man smiled sadly. "Not since he was 19. I looked toward Sebastian instinctively. Lorenzo's fingers moved lightly across the polished wood of his cane. He learned what responsibility costs. The answer sounded rehearsed somehow, like an old wound nobody discussed directly anymore. Before I could ask another question, Sebastian's phone rang again. This time he answered immediately in Italian, his voice dropping lower as he moved several feet away from the table. Even without understanding the language, I could hear tension building underneath his calm tone. Short sentences, precise questions, orders. When he ended the call, the entire room seemed to wait for him to speak. "The footage was copied before removal," he said finally. 3 separate accounts accessed it. Lorenzo sighed softly beneath his breath. "So now she is visible." I looked between them both. Visible to who exactly? Sebastian stepped toward the dining table slowly. The city lights behind him turned his dark suit into shadows and silver reflections. "People who study weakness," he said quietly. "People who look for leverage against families like mine. And they think I am leverage. At the moment," he admitted. "They are trying to decide." I stared down at the untouched tea in front of me. Steam curled softly upward between us while rain continued tapping against the windows. "This is insane," I whispered again. "I am literally just a bookstore employee." "No. You are the woman my father trusted." After 5 minutes. His voice softened slightly after that, barely noticeable. "That matters more than you realize." I looked up at him then, really looked at him. At the exhaustion beneath his perfect control. At the careful distance he kept between himself and everyone else in the room. Suddenly I understood something important. Sebastian Romano was not afraid for himself tonight. He was afraid for me. The realization settled strangely inside my chest before I could stop it. One of the guards approached quietly again then, speaking into Sebastian's ear. Whatever he whispered caused Sebastian's entire posture to tighten instantly. "No," he said sharply. "Absolutely not." Lorenzo straightened slowly in his, "What is it?" Sebastian's jaw hardened. His eyes lifted toward me with an expression I had not seen before. Not cold this time, furious, protective. "Someone just sent flowers to the bookstore where Claire works," he said quietly, addressed to her. Then after one terrible pause, he added, "They were delivered 20 minutes ago." The problem with fear is that eventually it stops feeling dramatic. It becomes practical instead. By 2:30 in the morning, I was sitting inside a silk robe that did not belong to me, drinking tea in a billionaire's penthouse while men discussed surveillance breaches and anonymous flowers like weather updates. Somewhere between the black SUVs and the hidden security gates, my panic had evolved into exhaustion. Sebastian stood near the window, speaking quietly with 2 guards while Manhattan glowed beneath the storm outside. Even tired, he looked impossible. Dark suit, sharp jawline, calm posture that somehow made everyone around him move more carefully. Men like him did not need to raise their voices. The room adjusted itself automatically around their silence. Lorenzo sat near the piano with one hand resting over the carved handle of his cane. "You should try to sleep for a few hours," he said gently toward me. I laughed softly into my tea. "I do not think my nervous system remembers how." A faint smile touched his face, understandable. Across the room, Sebastian ended his conversation abruptly and crossed toward us. The tension returned with him immediately. Controlled, cold, protective in a way I was starting to recognize too easily. "The bookstore is secure," he said quietly. "Nobody was harmed." I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding. What about the flowers? Something unreadable crossed his expression. White lilies. My stomach tightened slightly. That feels weirdly specific. Lorenzo sighed softly under his breath. It is specific. I looked between them both. What does that mean? Sebastian remained standing beside the dining table while rainwater reflected silver across the windows behind him. Lilies are sometimes used as a message, he said carefully. What kind of message? Silence. Then Lorenzo answered quietly from his chair, a reminder that innocence does not survive our world for very long. The room suddenly felt colder. I stared down at the tea in my hands for a second before speaking. You know what is crazy? Sebastian's attention lifted toward me immediately. 3 hours ago, I thought dangerous people only existed in documentaries and podcasts. A small breath escaped him, almost regret. I am sorry. The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard harder than anything else had tonight, because Sebastian Romano did not sound like a man apologizing out of politeness. He sounded like a man carrying responsibility he genuinely hated placing on someone else. You keep saying this is not your fault, I murmured. But it kind of feels like your life exploded into mine. His jaw tightened slightly. Yes. No excuses, no denial, just honesty. Somehow that made it harder to stay angry. One of the guards approached quietly then. The guest room is ready, sir. Sebastian nodded once before finally looking back at me. You should sleep upstairs tonight. I blinked. Upstairs? The private floor is more secure. You live in a building with multiple secure floors. Claire. His tone held the faintest hint of exhaustion now. Please stop sounding surprised every time my life sounds absurd. Despite everything, I laughed softly. Real laughter this time. Short, tired, human. And for one strange second, Sebastian simply stared at me like he had forgotten whatever thought was already in his head. Lorenzo noticed immediately. Of course he did. Blind did not mean unaware. Ah, the older man murmured quietly into his tea. Sebastian's focus snapped away first. He cleared his throat slightly before motioning toward the staircase near the far hallway. I will show you the room. The upstairs level somehow felt even quieter than the penthouse below. Soft lighting glowed beneath dark wooden ceilings while floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked rain-soaked Manhattan from impossible heights. Sebastian walked slightly ahead of me down the hallway, one hand resting loosely near his watch while security cameras tracked silently above us. Do you ever get tired of being watched? I asked quietly. He stopped walking for half a second before answering, constantly. The honesty in his voice surprised me again. He opened a large bedroom door near the end of the hall. Warm light spilled across cream-colored furniture, fresh linens, and a fireplace flickering softly against marble walls. The room looked larger than my entire apartment. This is where I am sleeping? It is only temporary. Your temporary is nicer than my permanent. One corner of his mouth moved faintly again. Get some rest, Claire. I nodded slowly before stepping inside. But just as he turned to leave, I spoke again. Sebastian. He paused in the doorway. What? I hesitated for one dangerous second too long. Why do I feel safer around you than I probably should? Silence filled the room immediately afterward. The city lights reflected softly across his face while rain whispered against the glass behind him. Sebastian looked at me with an expression so unreadable it almost hurt to hold eye contact. Then he answered quietly, "That is the part that worries me too."